I want really to thank the United Nations Information Center here and the ACOMS for organizing, for giving me the opportunity to present my talk today. And indeed, let me start. I will probably have more time to speak about United Nations University later today, but what I would like really to talk today is to somehow situate the responsibility to protect first in comparison to humanitarian intervention, and second in comparison to protection of civilians. Two concepts that existed historically much longer than R2P. I will talk about some challenges and some myths that still exist about R2P, and then I will move to the current day, 2011, the Arab Spring and R2P. Where it all started was the debates about whether legality of the use of force can be limited only to two situations. You know very well, the UN Charter prohibits the use of force with two exceptions. One is self-defense, Article 51, and the second is authorization by the Security Council, Article 42. But if the two exceptions do not work and still people are at deadly risk, how to respond to such a risk if the Security Council is silent? Many debates, hundreds of articles in many journals. Nobody could find any answer whether there is a right to humanitarian intervention as a third exception to the legality of the use of force. But states usually don't wait for scholars to find the concept. They intervene when they see necessity to save human lives. We have situations in 1971, in 1979, and more recently in 1999, NATO intervened in Serbia to, with the justification of saving Kosovo Albanians under risk. Now, what are the problems when states do so, when they unilaterally intervene without Security Council authorization? First, that they can do so not for proper purpose. They can do this for non-humanitarian purpose, for economic, political, or any other material interest. Oil, national interest can play larger role than the humanitarian purpose. Another problem is that if states intervene unilaterally, maybe, we don't know, it's counterfactual, but maybe other states could have done another effort to achieve solution through diplomacy. So somehow we are unsure whether unilateral intervention could be substituted by diplomacy. Also, we don't know how many troops, whether they will use properly the principle of proportionality, whether they will have a proper exit strategy. Again, a lot of question marks, as you can see. Another problem with unilateral humanitarian intervention was that sometimes you do more harm than good. Remember, the humanitarian intervention came from language which medical doctors often use. Bernard Kouchner, Médecins Sans Frontières, was talking about humanitarian intervention, helping people to survive. And it's also the question of a surgeon whether to intervene in human body to cure a disease, but that might kill a patient. It might be doing, again, more harm than good. So all these problems with unilateral intervention brought to a clear-cut criteria which led down the legitimacy of the use of force. Remember, legality of the use of force is very black and white. It's always yes or no. There is no chance to have a 50% legal action. It's always very clear-cut, black and white. Legitimacy, however, of the use of force can fluctuate. It can go up and down. It can gain or lose support. And the 5 criteria that justify use of force are seriousness of threat, proper purpose, last resort, proportionality, and balance of consequences. As you can see, they follow very much from the problems which I described in the earlier slide. And then we had that commission after Kosovo, which ended up saying that it was illegal but legitimate. The intervention in Kosovo was illegal, it was not authorized by the Security Council, but somehow it met those 5 criteria. There was a serious threat, it was a proper purpose, there was an attempt to reach diplomatic solution, it didn't work in several rounds, in Rambouillet. It was a proportionate use of force, and the balance of consequences was that it didn't do more harm than good. Again, people can question whether these are really met criteria, but the Commission of Inquiry in Kosovo decided that it was a legitimate action. So how to now compare humanitarian intervention with responsibility to protect? And somehow I remember when 10 years ago we had those debates after Kosovo, whether it's a legitimate or illegitimate use of force. We discussed in a meeting in London, part of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, whether there is a right to humanitarian intervention. And again, people always disagree about humanitarian intervention. We found that at one point, Gareth Evans came with the word responsibility to protect. He said, stop talking about humanitarian intervention. We will never agree on humanitarian intervention. Exactly because it is the terminology humanitarian intervention focuses on interests of intervening states. And consensus is never possible. We will never know why states intervene. Do they have second interest? Do they have oil and economic interest? It's impossible to reach a global consensus if we talk about humanitarian intervention. But if we change the language, if we focus not on states' interest, but focus on victims, people who will die, then you might feel there is a consensus. Nobody will disagree that people at deadly risk need protection. So changing the language from humanitarian intervention to responsibility to protect helped to reach that consensus. And somehow R2P reconciles sovereignty with responsibility. And that's where it all started. Responsibility to protect has its sources, and one of them is Francis Deng, UNHCR head at that time, who wrote about sovereignty as responsibility. Sovereignty is no longer an absolute power of a sovereign on a certain territory. It's not only top-bottom exercise of power and authority. It is also a bottom-up responsibility to people. So people give a sovereign the right to govern, and effectively sovereignty means responsibility. The African Charter, interestingly, in 1999 also used a language in Article 4H that states can intervene in member states in respect of grave circumstances such as war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Also, Kofi Annan wrote in The Economist an article called Two Concepts of Sovereignty, exactly describing the sovereignty as responsibility, as a new notion versus the old Westphalian understanding of sovereignty as absolute, unlimited power of a sovereign on a certain territory. And here we came to the International Commission, co-chaired by Gareth Evans and Mohamed Sanoun, and the report in 2001, for which I also contributed my humble part, came up exactly 10 years ago, 2001. We had the report out of ISIS. Now, let me move to a first myth. Very often you can see people saying R2P is Western, neo-imperialist concept. Even serious people say so. David Chandler wrote an article recently trying to argue R2P is Western and imperialist. I fully disagree. Where do you see Western? Let's go to the previous slide. It's not Western. Where did it start? Francis Deng, book Sovereignty and Responsibility. Kofi Annan, another African, who wrote Two Concepts of Sovereignty. It was African Union Charter first, writing about responsibility to protect. The Commission itself had 12 commissioners, 6 of them were from the South, 6 of them of the 12 were from North. Mohamed Sanoun, one of the co-chair, was from the South. I don't understand those who say R2P is Western. It's actually African concept, gradually adopted by other countries. it was the West who could jeopardize R2P in 2005, few weeks before the global summit. It was the United States permanent representative in New York, Bolton, who came up with significant amendments to the World Summit outcome document that could jeopardize the adoption of R2P. So if you hear that R2P is Western, please remember it's not true. It's an African concept that gained global acceptance later. And this is the text from the 2005 document. States have a responsibility to protect population from genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And if they fail to do so, the responsibility shifts to the international community. So basically we have a situation where states exercise responsibility domestically, Pillar 1. Some states cannot do that because they are weak. They are after conflict or because of poverty and underdevelopment. They need assistance, and here comes Pillar 2, helping states that need capacity to protect. And if states manifestly fail to protect, the Security Council utilizes diplomacy, sanctions, and use of force. So we have three very clear pillars. And here comes something which I will kind of say explains a lot of misconception about responsibility. This idea of a pyramid, where we have Pillar 1 in almost 80 or 85% of the states. We have Pillar 2 states that cannot meet their responsibility, but they acknowledge so. They are willing but unable to protect. They demand assistance, and this assistance comes from international organization, United Nations, regional organization, and bilateral donors. It is a capacity development or assistance pillar. And we have a very small number of situations which go into the third pillar, which is a manifest failure to protect. I'll say 1% of R2P is about Pillar 3, about 15-20% Pillar 2, and 80% Pillar 1. But interestingly, the concept started from the top of the pyramid, from Kosovo. And then it moved down. That's why very often people associate R2P with the tip of the iceberg, the top of the pyramid. And not only because of that, because it started from Kosovo, because also media report always situations that are of a grave danger. Usually media will never report that all the airplanes landed successfully. If one airplane crashes, that's what media will report. And that's normal. I don't blame media. That's how they do their job. But remember that R2P is not always about intervention. It's actually very little percentage, if you want, is about intervention. So if somebody tells you R2P is about military intervention, you can say yes, but only in 0.33% is about military intervention. You can ask me why I came up with this mathematics. At any time, we have only few states that are manifestly failing to protect. Sudan over Darfur for some years, maybe Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, Libya now, at some point Zimbabwe, Kenya, Myanmar, and so on. If you take a particular year, 2006 or 2008 or 2011, you'll find that that year only few states are in Pillar 3. Therefore, R2P is not about military, or it is about military intervention, but only very occasionally. So it's not a dangerous concept. It's not something that needs to worry us too much about. And this is 2009, as the introduction already mentioned, the moment when R2P came into a Secretary General report, and the focus was made to operationalize it. It was seen as narrow, focused only on atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes, but with very deep resource. Everything in the domestic or regional or United Nations systems can be utilized to focus on those narrow crimes. Everything in terms of diplomacy, power sharing agreement, mediation, negotiations, up to military force can be also utilized. Any agency can find its own angle to R2P, either in prevention or in reaction to crimes or in rebuilding. Somehow responsibility to prevent should not be confused with prevention of conflict, something which I found in the 2009 document. Is a bit of a confusion. They are talking a lot about prevention of conflict, which is a much larger agenda in the United Nations, but they should talk more about prevention of mass atrocity, which has a little bit more specific focus. Now let me compare R2P with protection of civilians. That's probably something more interesting, more recent. A project we did with Griffith University in Australia, sponsored by the Australian Fund for R2P, Alex Bellamy, is how to situate R2P with regard to protection of civilians, much more historical concept. They are very similar but somehow different, and I will explain in 3 slides: legal sources, actors, and relationship. But before that, I was thinking if I need to find one picture, one photo to illustrate R2P, and another photo to illustrate protection of civilians. And I was browsing my computer and trying to find photos, how to illustrate the two, and I kind of find the same always, like massacres and refugees and bloodshed. And somehow I have the feeling that the two concepts come together as one when it is a bloodshed and a situation of mass atrocity. However, R2P is a bit different. It is more preventive than protection of civilians. So I came up with this one for protection of civilians. My favorite photo on protection of civilians, a lovely little lady protected by a UN peacekeeper. But for the responsibility to protect, I ended up with this one. It's quite different. It could be drinking coffee with Kofi Annan in Kenya in 2008, preventing atrocities to happen in the streets of Nairobi and elsewhere in Kenya. So R2P is a bit different from protection of civilians. It has a huge potential for diplomacy and agreement. So if you want the comparison between the legal sources of R2P and POC, they're on this slide. Many of them are the same, but there are nuances. You have the 4 Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols that establish the war crimes. We have the Genocide Convention 1948. We have the Rome Statute for the ICC, which also lists the crimes against humanity and the ethnic cleansing, the forceful deportation, the legal term of ethnic cleansing. Domestic law, bilateral law, approaching each of the pillar 1, 2, and UN Charter, Chapter 6, 7, and 8, when it comes to pillar 3 situations. We have also relevant human rights law, and I say relevant because very often people simply put all the human rights law into one big basket and say this is the history of R2P or POC. I would be more specific. I would say some parts of human rights law have relevance to R2P. In this particular case, for example, non-discrimination of ethnic minority will be very relevant. When it comes to POC, protection of civilians, we have the 4th, not all 4, but only the last, the 4th convention, which is on protection of civilians in particular. Refugee laws, 1951 convention, the Convention on IDPs, 2009 African Union Convention. Certain Security Council resolutions give legality to operations on POC. National Army manuals also talk about protection of civilians. Disarmament Treaty, the 97 Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention, Prohibition Convention. The Cluster Munition 2010 Convention is also protection of civilians. And also relevant human rights law. Prohibition of recruitment of children in armed forces, for example, would fall into that. So you can see the legal sources of R2P and POC are more or less the same, but they have difference as well. We have a lot of similarities and some differences. Yes, as the introduction already mentioned, we have the joint office possibly creating soon with the special advisor on the prevention of genocide, Francis Deng, and the special representative on R2P joining their offices into one. And various agencies in the United Nations system or in the regional organizations also working on both R2P and POC. Again, we have domestic and regional and international actors. Some of them, as you can see in the graph, are the same, some are different. And what is really the relationship between R2P and POC? We were struggling with whether they are sisters or whether they are cousins, whether they are twin sisters. Well, probably they are cousins, not sisters in a way. They can reinforce each other, but also there could be a tension. POC is a clear legal obligation, whereas R2P is more political commitment. It's not yet described as a norm as such. It has a normative quality in the words of Ed Luck, but this is not yet a norm. It is important to talk in R2P language when it comes to serious situation, to genocidal situation. It is a catalyst for action, which otherwise slow and lazy agency may. They can do protection for decades, but R2P brings this emergency when the situation suddenly deteriorates, when we have an escalation of conflict, mass atrocity emerging, then it's very important to talk in terms of R2P, to somehow galvanize, if you want, political action and to operationalize the otherwise existing agenda in a more normal circumstances. We found that some agencies are actually reluctant to talk about R2P, OCHA, and even ICRC. And they say we do protections of civilians, this is our mandate. But exactly because there were uncertainties in the General Assembly about R2P, they were reluctant to talk about R2P. They say this is not legal, we prefer to operate in a clear mandate, what is given to us. And the challenges to R2P. First is that it really doesn't apply to gross violations of human rights if those are not amounting to genocide or crimes against humanity. It doesn't apply to non-state actors. Remember the three pillars. First pillar, states exercise responsibility. Second pillar, states helping other states. Third pillar, Security Council, the powerful states. It's always about states. Huh? There's nothing about non-state actors in the R2P concept. So. But very often it was the rebels who also need to exercise responsibility in a civil war situation, Sri Lanka or Libya. The R2P doesn't extend to what I call in one of my articles a responsibility to prosecute, R2P2. One thing is to protect the victims, but we also have the second element, which is the perpetrators, the responsibility to prosecute perpetrators. And finally, it's a kind of a perennial problem that we rely on a Security Council that may stuck with a veto, with anachronistic arrangements and membership and veto. And that's what happened when Security Council's members are not, it's a caricature from back in Darfur when one of the permanent members was not ready enough to act. Now let me move to the R2P, let me move to the days of 2011. And somehow to situate R2P within what's going on in Libya and other parts of North Africa and Middle East. First of all, let me say that the Arab Spring is not the first time when responsibility to protect was utilized by the UN Security Council. There were previous resolutions already talking in R2P language in situations such as Sudan or Darfur. But what is for the first time in the Arab Spring is that the Security Council authorized all necessary measures of use of force and establish a no-fly zone in an R2P situation. And the Security Council also acted very much because the regional organization, the Arab League and the African Union, already demanded no-fly zone to protect civilians in eastern Libya. And in February 26, 2011, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1970, which described the situation in Libya as widespread and systematic attacks against civilian population that may amount to crimes against humanity. It's a very clear determination that the situation is moving to crimes against humanity, which constitutes an international threat to international peace and security. Already the Council uses language to apply Chapter 7. It recalls the Libyan authorities' responsibility to protect its population. Interestingly, it calls the first pillar, Pillar 1, Libya should protect its population. Very good reminder that states have that obligation of 2005 outcome document, that they have to protect their population, and only if manifestly they fail to do so, then the Security Council steps in, which is the situation. Acting under Chapter 7, the Council decided first to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, which later indicted several of the Libyan leaders. It imposed an arms embargo. It imposed a travel ban, also for particular individuals, not for all, but for some. And it imposed asset freeze, the so-called smart sanction, travel ban and asset freeze on particular individuals listed in the annex of the resolution 1970. 15 to nil, so full consensus in the Security Council in determining the situation as threat to the peace, in reminding Libya R2P obligations and imposing non-military measure at that stage. The resolution didn't produce much result. The situation remained very fragile. People were under deadly risk. And a few weeks later, 17th of March, again, the Security Council adopts a new resolution, 1973. More problematic vote, 10 votes in favor, 5 states abstain from the resolution. If you look at the list, it's Brazil, China, Germany, India, and Russia. 2 permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia, and 3 non-permanent members, but states that pretend to become permanent members, Brazil, Germany, and India. So it was a very problematic vote, and still successful. The resolution was adopted. Paragraph 4 of the resolution says that any state notifying and in cooperation with the Secretary General can undertake all necessary measures to protect civilian population. It's a very similar language to previous resolution authorizing military force. However, it has an important limitation, which is that no foreign occupation force can be formed on any part of the Libyan territory. So we can use force, but without occupying a territory in Libya. Paragraph 5 establishes a no-fly zone in Libya. That was also one of the requests of the Arab League and the African Union. And interestingly, paragraph 13 of the resolution authorizes force for something very specific, which is to enforce the arms embargo, authorizing states to use all necessary measures to carry out inspections, to stop shipments, inspect cargoes, and if there is a violation of the embargo, they can report to the Security Council. It's kind of a second. Remember that the same happened with the resolution on Iraq in 1990. It was not 678 which first authorized use of force. It was another resolution, 665, earlier than that, that authorized states to use force to stop and inspect shipments and cargoes in violation of the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq in 1990. So in a similar way, the Security Council also exercise its authority to impose a similar measure in Libya. Now, a question, and it's a difficult one. Are the resolutions 1970 and 73 a triumph of R2P, or are they its defeat? Usually I have both answers. I can argue it's a triumph first, okay, if you want. Yes, it's a triumph. What R2P says is when states manifestly fail to protect, the case of Libya, the responsibility shifts to international community. Also, the resolutions were very clear that their objective is to protect civilian population. So if we ask, is the civilian population of Benghazi today safer than before 17th of March? Probably yes. The population was under very severe threat before 17th of March. The regime was basically threatening a bloodshed in Benghazi and eastern Libya. We see civil war going on every day, but at least the civilian population is under certain circumstances outside the fight between the rebels and the government. Gaddafi is still in power, but it was never in the Security Council resolution's mandate to remove Gaddafi from power. So again, it's not a failure in a sense. It's nowhere in the resolution, the removal of the leader from power. What the resolutions were very clearly mentioning Gaddafi twice was about asset freeze and travel ban, and that's in place. And also military action is a small part of all the efforts to coerce the regime. It's not the only part of the resolution. Remember, the resolution has many other parts, which is also referral to ICC, travel ban, no-fly zone, asset freeze. So these are also part of the resolution. So in a sense, I would academically argue that the resolutions 1970 and 1973 represent the triumph of R2P with Security Council Resolution 1970 and 1973. So this is where R2P is missing and is in danger. If other people are at deadly risk and nobody is going to protect them. And we see situations where people are at risk and they are not protected. And again, what would be the alternatives if there is no willingness in the Security Council to act? Again, we can think of diplomacy, we can think of sanctions. Unilateral sanctions are not illegal. Unilateral use of force is illegal, but states can adopt sanctions without asking Security Council to do so. Unilaterally, and they do. They very often, the European Union established sanctions on the regime in Syria, for example. And another opportunity would be a General Assembly action in the same way as they did with Uniting for Peace resolution and one precedent in 1950 to establish a mandate. And it's not only the Security Council that can authorize force, in other words, it's also the General Assembly. Okay, I'm yours for your questions. Thank you very much. I really admire an audience which gives me an opportunity to develop what I probably missed to mention because of the time limits. And the criteria which are on the screen, they really go back to the just war theory. You can see last resort in the early Catholic writings about ultima ratio. If you go back to the time of Aquinas, you'll see also proper purpose and proportionality. These are very long. Actually, I didn't go into details, but in one of the slides, when I compared the legal sources, I mentioned the prior to the Geneva Convention, you have international humanitarian law going back into the centuries of the development of use in bellow traditions. In fact, protection of civilians was there always in the antique times as well. And we have more development in various religious traditions. And I wrote a book in 2009 called World Religions and Norms of War, which situated many of those norms back in very early texts when Hinduism or Buddhism or Judaism developed the norms, including the protection of civilians. Indeed, this is not something which started in 1945. What happened in 1945 with the UN Charter, with the Nuremberg Charter, the human rights law, was that those norms were universalized. They became international norms. But they existed for millenniums of years in every single tradition, in every single country. So I really admire to bring just war and the history of the existence of protection of civilians, and also the responsibility. I fully agree. Responsibility to protect is always there. It was every philosopher in the 18th century or 17th century would also challenge the sovereign power as a power to murder citizens. It is very unique that in fact those who you are supposed to protect become a target for attacks. And unfortunately, many sovereigns at that time, fighting political opposition and people who revolted, the rebels, understood sovereignty as the right to kill everybody who opposes the rule of the tyrant. Many tyrants understood sovereignty as the right to murder those who oppose their rule. And this was exactly incorrect, because somehow sovereignty as a responsibility is not something which Francis Deng discovered in 1994. It was in the writing of many of Thomas Hobbes, Kant, and Rousseau, and many others. The human rights and the responsibility of governments to protect life of those who are under their jurisdiction is a very old concept. It goes even, I would say, back into the religious tradition. It's not even the American Constitution or the French Revolution. It goes even earlier than that. So I fully agree. The concept is old, but it's formulated as such and universalized as such with the 2001 report and 2005 General Assembly World Summit document. And I also fully agree with the challenge to my pyramid, and there are states outside the pyramid. I admire that comment, that you cannot situate Israel into this pyramid. And Palestinians in Gaza remain unprotected. It's not pillar one, it's not pillar two, because some states are too arrogant to accept assistance. And it's not pillar 3 because no Security Council action can be taken against some of those states. So there are states outside the pyramid, unfortunately. I agree, and very little can be done because of, again, Security Council will impose a veto if an action is aimed at that. But I agree. There are situations of unwillingness that cannot be resolved with the existing instrumentarium of the international system. And probably the only way is blame and shame and some diplomatic measures, some economic pressures, and so on. Well, I'm coming from a former communist country, Bulgaria. I remember that somehow those years, like 25 years ago, it was very difficult to imagine things will change. But they did change. Somehow there is always some light in the end of the tunnel. That some pressures, some principal engagement, even with those who violate human rights, can produce changes. And again, thank you very much for raising the issue of Iraq 1991. Exactly, you are absolutely correct. This is par excellence humanitarian intervention, Resolution 688, no-fly zone in northern Iraq, which was exactly the first time in its history the Security Council took the violations of the rights of a minority, the Kurdish northern Iraq, as a consideration of international threat to peace and security, and established no-fly zone. I admire that as an example of humanitarian intervention adopted, authorized by the Security Council. Somehow it fell out of my presentation because it focused on the non-authorized intervention. But in fact, Security Council often took action back in the 90s, and it's actually not only in the northern Iraq. If you take Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia, at that time many resolutions of the Security Council also point to possible crimes against humanity, gross violations of human rights amounting to crime against humanity. When the Security Council authorized protection forces in Yugoslavia, very often the consideration was humanitarian. Therefore, I would say humanitarian intervention was utilized by individual states in the example I showed, but there are also consideration of similar situation by the Security Council, and many resolutions, in fact, mention the concern with the large number of people at massive risks. Now, indeed, there are many other things happening in Libya apart from what is authorized in the resolution. I fully agree. It's not, if you look at the text of 1970 and 1973, it deals only with protection of civilians and authorization of measures, sanctions, and all necessary other measures, including use of force, to protect civilians. And there are action outside that mandate, of course. NATO does protection of civilians, but it does also other things. And you can judge those other things, but I will not blame R2P. See, I would like to detach R2P as one particular set of action which is authorized by the Security Council and which is formulated in the documents on R2P from everything else which happens in Libya. There are even actions with political pressures, opportunities for dialogue, and so on. So I would say my judgment on Libya in general will be different if I fully agree that some action of NATO may deteriorate the situation, but it will be not authorized to protect civilians as 1973 does. Military and political leaders can do many other things, and even if they say this is R2P, it's not correct. R2P can be abused. Russians did it in Georgia in 2007. They thought this is an R2P action, but again, we have to judge that, whether it was an R2P action. I'll say R2P can be abused as everything else can be. Humanitarian intervention was abused many times. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia saying this is humanitarian intervention. This is protection of Germans in Czechoslovakia. But the fact that some people abuse R2P doesn't mean R2P diminishes its own normative value. Abuse of law doesn't make law disappear. On the opposite, we need law, we need R2P, exactly to keep standards high and to blame those who will violate the laws. In other words, I'll say, I will detach everything else, which is not protection of civilians, and is happening in Libya, from the mandate in the resolution. So if NATO does something, it's not in the resolution. If they try to kill Gaddafi but kill his children instead, it's not in the resolution. It's a violation. It's a war crime. If NATO kills civilians, it's a war crime, so we should name it as a war crime. It's not R2P, it's not protection of civilians, it's actually killing of civilians. And that, I agree, can jeopardize the norm. But we have to protect the norm. We have to say, this is not under the mandate, it is a violation of R2P. Longer the question goes, you more find the answer in the same question, and I enjoy that. And all I can say probably is that I agree with you all that, in fact, we the people is a strong message, and the civil society, we've seen many examples actually. If we go back to the anti-landmine personnel landmine convention and the establishment of the ICC, the effort of the people all over the world and the World Federalist Movement and the Coalition for ICC, Bill Pace, all these actions. Kofi Annan supported civil society strongly in 2005, 2006. They become an actor. Now governments cannot do everything they want to do. It's already a realization that it's more difficult to govern today than 20 years ago. Civil society became part of the global governance. It's absolutely acknowledged everywhere. In fact, I worked in Russia before Tokyo, and I found that sometimes, even in a situation of restrictions, the civil society can do a lot. We found cooperation in local authorities sometimes. We found that it's possible to do a lot of effort. Civil society is absolutely crucial actor today. So in a way, I agree with you. We don't need to reinvent things. They are written in the UN Charter. We need just to continue advocating and following up on that. Now let me move to the question of accountability. I fully agree with that. We cannot have an efficient international system where we put the norms and the laws, and states can interpret them differently. They can comply, they can not comply. And when situations such as Rwanda and Srebrenica happen, we also have the accountability of the international organizations, not only of states. I fully agree with you. It's also an accountability for the peacekeepers, those who are sent there. But at that time, peacekeeping was very much seen as, in a very traditionalist way, as non-intervention. It's basically a presence as such. There was no mandate to protect civilians. Actually, the peacekeeping, only after Brahimi report in 2000, became a little bit more coercive and a bit more proactive in protection of civilians. In 90, I remember talking to people like Yasushi Akashi and others who were those who led the UNPFOR in former Yugoslavia. And in fact, they also acknowledged the limitations of what they could do. And certainly Romeo Dallaire in Rwanda experienced such a psychological shock that people are killed in front of their eyes and very little can be done. You don't have a legal mandate to do anything. The concept developed after Brahimi report, and now every single peacekeeping operation has a protection of civilian mandate. They can no longer hide behind lack of legal mandate. They have proactively to engage and rescue human life. The question, however, is, are they equipped to do that? Can they effectively do that? Again, Romeo Dallaire argued in Rwanda that he needed 5,000 people trained and equipped, and he could have saved lives. He didn't promise to save all lives, but he said with 5,000 well-equipped force in 1994 in Rwanda, I would have prevented a lot of this happening. Unfortunately, we always realize post facto the question is, do we learn lessons? Can we do better next time when something like that happens? Hopefully, yes. I think Rwanda and Srebrenica are two major disasters in UN, and Kofi Annan went and apologized. Bill Clinton went and apologized to Rwanda for the lack of action, for the major failure of political will. And it goes back into, again, we have a good system and legal sources and pyramids and good understanding of how the issues should be. But unless states and actors and civil society act together to generate political will to stop genocide and crimes against humanity, nothing will happen. So here comes the kind of the opportunity, and I think UN is learning lessons. Again, I might sound a bit optimistic, but I think after one incident, a lot of efforts is done to include POC into every peacekeeping operation. There are strategies developed also in national level, army manuals, and so on. And yes, I agree that R2P can be seen as a set of laws, and it's again, the Genocide Convention is preventing and punishing genocide. It's an obligation on state. The Geneva Conventions have a lot on R2P, the protection of civilians and responsibilities in cases of war crimes. Again, everything which R2P, some say R2P is nothing new, it existed always, it's everywhere in the international law, in the international humanitarian law, human rights law, domestic law. States have a responsibility to protect. So it's basically a collection of existing laws formulated as such, concerning only the atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. And although states may say we agree with R2P, but we don't see it as a normative, then what you should do is simply remind them what are the laws, remind them the Genocide Convention. If they don't accept R2P, let's bring everything else, which they already agree with, Genocide Convention, Geneva Convention, Rome Statute for ICC and all that. So if they want to, you have the tool to demand states' accountability and responsibility based on the IHL and on the human rights law and everything else. So even if they disagree that R2P is not, there is a law. So I would agree that R2P can be utilized as a generator to demand state accountability and push them to accept that. I think I agree that more has been done in terms of prosecution rather than prevention of genocide. Punishing genocide when it happened sometimes is almost used as an excuse for not being able to prevent. Exactly, the Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, happened very quickly after that, as already we had another tribunal for Yugoslavia, set by the Security Council in 1993, ICTY, with the legal mandate to prosecute violations of international humanitarian law in Rwanda. Prevention of genocide is a difficult task. Actually, interviewing Francis Deng last year in New York, he admitted so. He was looking for what should we monitor exactly? Hate speech, publications, ethnic tensions. What exactly can be the early warning for genocide? And unfortunately, we kind of still lack knowledge and early warning for genocide. I hope there will be more research and criteria and parameters where we can identify early signals that genocide is in preparation. Because only such warning can give an opportunity for action for the civil society and for the media to signal that genocide is in preparation in order to take quick action. I fully agree. It's still a missing element. What is more focus has been done more on punishing perpetrators post facto rather than on prevention.